Good afternoon. My name is Anabel González, and I'm the Senior Director for the Global Practice on Trade and Competitiveness here at the World Bank Group. I will be your moderator for this event that is jointly hosted by the World Bank Group and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. The topic of today's discussion is the role of competition policies in helping markets perform better. So this event is being live streamed, so welcome to those of you who are following us online, and welcome, of course, to those of you who are here in person in Washington. For those of you on Twitter, please share your comments and your questions using the hashtag competition4DEV, D-E-V. So let me now introduce Mr. Joachim Levy, Managing Director and Vice President, Chief Financial Officer of the World Bank Group, to give some initial remarks. So welcome, Joachim. Thank you.
Okay, well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I think that's a really important topic. And of course, I'm very glad that we have such a diverse panel that shows the importance and the progress of competition issues and how we can foster competition around the world, and in particular in developed countries. We're also very glad to have Don Ángel Gurría. It's a great partner, not only of the World Bank, but also of many countries within the G20 and beyond that, and a real champion for competition. So it's really special. It's such an important occasion that I was directed to read a statement. So if you allow me, I'm going to read a statement so that I can be sure that we will say all the important things. And I think that there are very important facts here that I'm sure all of you will like to keep in mind. And these are facts that show the power of competition and unleashing growth and a greater participation in economies. So regardless of their diverse culture and economic models, the vast majority of countries share a common vision. This vision is to become prosperous and competitive nations and ultimately raise the quality of life for their citizens. Competition is increasingly acknowledged to be an indispensable ingredient to achieve this vision. By propelling greater productivity across a country's firms and industries, effective market competition can lift a population prosperity and facilitate sustainable growth. We all know that the way to ensure rising wages and compensation in general is by increasing productivity. And there is no better engine and a stimulus to increase productivity than competition. Sound competition policies allow efficient firms to enter the market and expand with the competitive process driving resources to the most productive uses. Studies show labor productivity gains in retail, a boost also in agriculture, and lower costs in telecoms and transport and other services after competition reforms are really carried out. Evidence on the relationship between competition and productivity is overwhelming. World Bank study, actually made by the World Bank Group, a study in Turkey, for instance, found that a 10% decrease in the average price-cost margins, a measure of competition, would increase labor productivity growth by 4.5% a year. This is also another interesting thing about competition, is that a reform continue to use the returns over time, because it not only, of course, provides a one-off increase, but often is also translated in an increase in the potential rate of growth of the country. Taking, for instance, in Tunisia, a research also from the bank group found that even a modest increase in competition, something around 5% reduction in margins, would boost labor productivity by an additional 5% a year. And eliminating cartels, this clear indication of lack of competition, had shown to increase productivity by up to 30 percentage points. So extremely powerful, with gains that often favor the poorest in the country. To improve their productivity and competitiveness, firms require access to high quality and affordable inputs. Exporters need efficient transportation and reliable and affordable energy supply, and small and medium entrepreneurs need fast and competitive telecommunications and professional services. Together with the OECD, the bank group has kick-started the process of generating data on where market regulations in these sectors, transportation, telecommunication, professional service, transportation, hinder competition. Today, we are glad to announce that the result of this cooperation, we have data already for 19 developing countries. We also have worked to quantify the impact of reforms in market that several other industries use as inputs. For instance, if you take simulations with South Africa or Peru, we found that just reducing restrictions and professional service regulations would spur the growth in industries that feed small and medium enterprises by up to 0.4 percentage points of GDP annually. In South Africa, this would be equivalent of about $1.4 billion a year. Making markets work is essential also to attract investment. By lowering the service restriction and regulation, we can increase the level of investment by even 50% in some cases. One way competition can support this is by bolstering the nation's gains from trade. More intense domestic competition enables firms to increase their exports in new markets and in new products. It also ensures that the trade benefits are passed down the value chain to small producers and consumers rather than be captured by intermediary or big groups. We at the World Bank Group also work to quantify the direct effect of more competition, or sometimes the lack of it, on the quality of life of citizens. In South Africa, again, we found that tackling just 4 cartels agreements that deal with maize, wheat, poultry, and pharmaceuticals, these are just 4 out of more than 76 cartels sanctioned in the country in the last decade. Well, just by doing this, we'll decrease poverty rate by 0.4 percentage points. If these 4 cartels had continued, South African consumers would be losing at least $480 million a year. So that we see the magnitude of really addressing competition issues. In Kenya, we found that market reforms to increase competition in the sugar and maize markets would reduce poverty by 1.5% in the overall measure. So again, it's a very significant result for just 2 industries actually. In both cases, of course, as I mentioned, the greater impact will be in the poorest households. But behind those numbers are individual stories and the citizens who have more opportunities as a result of sound competitions. And if you look at just a few of reforms that have happened, we can see this impact. I take Brazil, for instance, where the elimination of exclusivity contracts in payment services have allowed small business owners to make accessible to use a unique platform for credit cards. They are now paying 16% less to payment provider, just by competition in the credit card market. In the case of Mexico, I think it's also striking the impact of the liberalization of the air travel industry. There, allowing low-cost airlines such as Interjet and Volaris to compete with traditional airlines have saved about 40% in the fares, and this, just in the connection U.S. and Mexico, means to reduce fares for about 20 million families, because of course there is so much travel between the two countries, and these are people for whom to have lower fares, 40% lower, is so important. So literally millions of people benefiting every year from more competition. However, despite the emerging body of systematic and individual evidence, competition is still an underexplored policy area, and there is ample scope for further research. The work we will hear about today represents the front line in new knowledge on the topic. New evidence speaks of how competition not only lifts average income levels, but shifts welfare in favor of the poorest. We are proud to have developed these studies and this research in collaboration with OECD. Thank you. Thank you for your leadership in this and so many other things. Our partnership with the Secretary General Gurría and his team is one of that not only leverages each organization's strengths, but ultimately serves our clients and counterparts. With this new knowledge product and the bank group's new market and competition assessment tool that I'm sure will be explained, designed to provide technical and practical guidance on competition policies for increased equitable growth, we'll continue to work with our client countries to achieve clear results in the near term. Given the important contribution of competition policy to the bank group's twin goals, to the extreme poverty and increased shared prosperity that are our twin goals in the World Bank, it is an area that we're committed to building even further. I would like to say, in a very personal note, that when I was in the public sector in Brazil, no doubt, the commitment of the World Bank in helping to address and study some areas of competition, professional service, a lot of things linked to infrastructure, how you can rewrite bidding contracts to increase the competition, to ensure that we have more smaller firms as well in some cases foreign firms coming and bidding to public works and to work associated to concession, had a tremendous impact and were extremely helpful and continue. I think Gaetani will mention, will continue to help us to reduce the cost to have infrastructure built with all the positive impact that this has on potential growth and in combating poverty. So again, it's a great pleasure and honor to be with such a distinct panel, bringing experience from so many different countries. And I think this continues to be one of the leading, say, contributions of the World Bank in addressing root causes for poverty and underdevelopment. So we will reinforce our commitment to increase the knowledge about these and helping our client countries to develop policies that unleash growth and better income distribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me invite now Mr. Ángel Gurría, Secretary General of the OECD, to the podium, please.
Estimados Joaquim, dear ministers, ladies and gentlemen, friends, delighted to co-host this event on competition as a tool for helping markets perform better. Today I'll share with you some of the highlights from the OECD's joint work with the World Bank to promote effective competition policies in pursuit of stronger, more inclusive economic growth. This is the joint work, and I commend you to read it. It's a very, very substantive contribution, and it also picks up some of the latest work on the subject. Now, we share a common understanding of the importance of open and competitive product markets for efficiency, innovation, and inclusive growth. Unfortunately, we also know that a pro-competition reform agenda is not without its challenges. The prospect of stronger competition inevitably stirs opposition as open markets and new suppliers drive down rents. Now, to persuade constituencies of the merits of pro-competition reforms, policymakers need clear evidence on the size and nature of the expected gains, informed by the right tools and the metrics. Importantly, these instruments not only support the credibility of the policy recommendations, they're also critical for monitoring and assessing progress. 20 years ago, the OECD developed the Product Market Regulation Indicators. Product Market Regulation Indicator, the PMRI, and a quantitative tool that measures the incidence of regulatory barriers to competition through state control of business, legal and administrative barriers to the startups, obstacles to foreign trade and investment. And the indicator has been used extensively by OECD countries to pursue a pro-competition agenda through better regulation. It also has allowed us to do all these comparisons, so then the country looks at itself kind of very much to the right or very much to the left, and they say, oh my God, what's going on? And that encourages, that nothing catches a minister than to see the bar, we put it in red, very much to the right. They say, you're the last. I'm like, oh my God. They immediately catch up and they say, we have to do better. But you need the information, you need to measure it first. You can't measure it, you can't manage it. Detailed information underpinning the indicator that is regularly updated has empowered policymakers to shine the policy spotlight on specific aspects of product market regulation that hinder competition. Has also facilitated direct comparisons of regulatory practices across OECD countries, and that has catalyzed substantial reductions in barriers to competition over the years. What we do is basically put a big mirror in front of people, and we say, okay, look at yourself in the mirror, naked, and then see if you like what is in the mirror, And then, well, sometimes exceptionally they do like it, but most of the time they say, well, we can do better, Now, thanks to the fruitful collaboration with the World Bank, we've extended the coverage of the Product Market Regulation Indicator to a large number of non-OECD countries, Latin America, Caribbean, Africa, Asia. The highlights of the work are summarized in a note prepared jointly by the OECD and the World Bank, copies of which are available here today. This book and then the note, right? Or is this the note? It's a big, it's a very colorful note. So good note, it's a heavy note, fat note. The result suggests that regulatory barriers to competition are, on average, higher in emerging market economies than in more advanced economies. That is kind of intuitive, but once you see it, and once you see by how much and where and when, it kind of dawns on you that, one can actually do better. The differences are most pronounced in two areas. Obstacles to foreign trade and investment, that's a kind of a classic, and barriers to the entry of new businesses in network industries. Energy, transport, communications, telecommunications in particular. Those are some of the more popular, higher indicators of the product market regulation. Of course, these averages, they mask substantial differences across emerging market economies. Many of them have implemented regulations that are as competition-friendly as any of the more advanced economies. But in many, in fact, the majority, the scope for lowering barriers to entry and competition is sizable. There are many, many low-hanging fruits waiting to be picked. Provided that product market regulation reforms are supported by a vigorous antitrust regime and enforced by a strong and independent competition agency, the potential gains from reducing barriers to entry are substantial indeed. OECD analysis shows that a 30% reduction in regulatory barriers to competition, and 30% is like the typical difference, the average difference between the advanced and the emerging economies in terms of how restrictive both are. Well, you just use that average, nothing too exciting, just, what we see regularly across the countries, could lift productivity in countries like Brazil and Mexico by as much as 4% after 5 years. Now, this lifting productivity is like cutthroat business. Everybody's trying to lift productivity, and actually productivity is so happy going down and down and down in terms of its growth. And the same is in Turkey, and the same is in the UK, and the same is in the United States, and the same is in Italy. We're having all these problems getting productivity going again. But then you see one element here after 3 or 4 or 5 could increase productivity by 5 points. It's just massive possibilities. Now, before closing, let me say a few words about competition and inclusiveness, or the link thereof. We know that inequality of incomes, inequality of outcomes, of wealth, of opportunity adversely affect people's well-being and undermine their ability to fulfill their potential. Now, ongoing OECD World Bank work on competition policy, shared prosperity, and inclusive growth shows that addressing persistent, unwarranted, illegitimate market power, reducing anti-competitive regulations, fighting illegal cartels, and preventing abusive conduct is not only good for growth and innovation, it can also help reduce inequality and improve social cohesion. In fact, this work suggests that reducing market power could disproportionately benefit low-income households and therefore narrow income inequality. And this reflects two factors. First, the poorest are hit hardest by a lack of competition. And, why is that? Well, because overpriced goods account for a large share of their consumption. If you have less competition, then the poor have less options. They only have to go buy the products that are subjected to less competition. Those will be between 20, 30, 40% more expensive. So the poorest will buy their basket of basic satisfactors at a quarter to 40% more expensive when, of course, they need the money more. Now, excess market rents or profits represent a transfer of income towards financial asset holders who are overwhelmingly concentrated at the top of the income distribution. This is why the release today of this OECD World Bank joint publication was step ahead. Examines the links between competition, shared prosperity, and inclusive growth. It is a massively important milestone. And let me tell you, we at the OECD are going to have our ministerial meeting this year, in June. And of course, we used to go to all these international meetings and productivity, 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 inclusiveness, inclusiveness, inclusiveness. So he said, okay, what is the theme of our Ministerial Council meeting this year? It's going to be chaired by Chile, by the way. President Bachelet is going to be chairing. So he said, well, how about inclusive productivity? Somebody, just to be even more confusing, said productive inclusivity, but no, we discarded that one. Inclusive productivity. You can't imagine the controversy that elicited among our members and their experts and their directors and their, all the geniuses, even our own people here. We have the chief economist here with us today. The whole discussion about whether inclusive productivity even makes sense as an expression. And we'd like to remind them there that when we said for the first time, green growth, they said, that's crazy. What are you talking about? Green growth. That's a contradiction in terms. Today, who says green without saying growth, or who says growth without saying green, They go together. They walk together, hand in hand. Well, we believe that inclusive productivity is going to be the same case, that we're going to be moving towards the sunset, It's a romantic notion. With inclusive productivity. But we're going to see. We're going to have to test that. But the fact that we're looking, because as Joaquim said, competition is an absolutely crucial element of productivity. And now we're saying that competition is an inclusive element of less inequality, of more inclusiveness. So therefore, we have found now one common element of inclusion and of productivity, which is competition, And I'm sure we're going to be finding many more like that. We're going to find the nexus, the nexus between inclusiveness and productivity. So, dear friends, this agenda, using both the product market regulation indicators and the OECD competition assessment toolkit, is going to be an invaluable instrument in order to promote both lowering product market regulation. People don't even know what you're talking about. And it applies particularly to services. After all, services are now about 70%, 75% of the developed economies, more than 50% of developing economies. And suddenly you confront each one of the ministers with their own map of where services trade restrictiveness index for your country, And they look at it and say, couriers, railway and airlines and lawyers and architects, whatever. They look at the whole thing. I remember vividly the reaction of the Minister of Australia. When we first presented this to him, he said, he's no longer there, so I can say that. He said, I had no clue that we in Australia were restrictive about couriers. said, I didn't have any idea. He said, but I'm going to hit Canberra on Monday, and we're going to start looking at this. Well, we gave the 40 ministers that were around the table, each one his own one page with a little graph about how they were restrictive in all these areas, and who was more restrictive where, who was the best in each area, and what was the average in each area. I said, at least get to the average. And then, for those who are close to the average, try to get to the best. Well, again, this is product market regulation indicators. All of them had room to improve. And these are some of the more advanced. Of course, the more you move into developing countries, then there's more room for improvement on the product market regulation and also on the competition element. So I hope that the outcome of our productive collaboration with the World Bank will fuel the drive towards more open and competitive markets around the world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joaquim and Ángel, for sharing your insights on this important topic, building on the fruitful collaboration that our two institutions have developed over the past few years. Our teams at the World Bank Group and at the OECD have pursued this joint effort with the goal of supporting our counterparts to help foster economic development and to achieve our institutional commitments. In the case of the World Bank Group, eradicate poverty by 2030 and boosting shared prosperity. The experience of implementing pro-competition reforms, as we will discuss today, brings us closer to achieving these goals. Now, our efforts provide some strong examples that can be considered by regional and international organizations. They will also help us inform the increasing demand from developing countries in this policy area. Right now, we are supporting about 50 developing countries in their efforts to promote and implement pro-competition rules in key sectors, to deter anti-competitiveness business practices such as cartel agreements, and to minimize distorting government interventions in markets. Today's panelists will share with us why competition policy matters for broader public policies and how more effective competition can lead to better development outcomes. Our task is not only about identifying the presence of such issues, but also about evaluating what actions and reforms are needed in the competition space to achieve broader developmental goals. Understanding market dynamics, as well as going beyond the policies as they're written in laws and regulations and looking at their actual implementation, will be vital. Even more important than the what is actually the how. How to make these reforms feasible, successful, and sustainable over time in a specific country context. We know that these reforms are often challenging. They take time, and their results depend on the details of the implementation. So it is essential to consider the prioritization and sequencing of relevant reforms, the measurement of their impact, the adaptation to local context, and the communication to and involvement of various stakeholders, as well as a hands-on implementation that builds local capacity. On the how, I am pleased to announce today the publication of the latest round of competition advocacy contests co-sponsored by the International Competition Network and the World Bank Group. This contest grants annual awards to governments that have changed how markets work through the implementation of pro-competition policies. So we have not one, but two reports, as Mr. Gurría was saying. So in this book, we systematize for the first time new developments and recent trends in competition advocacy that are innovative, that are successful, and that represent a strong positive example for others. So we will hear more throughout today's event about how these gains occurred. And we have among the audience here today representatives of most of the countries that have received awards in the past few years. So I would like to recognize in particular Emmanuel Esguerra, Secretary of Social Economic Planning of the Philippines. Let me now introduce the panel members that we have with us here today. Dr. Alonso Segura, Minister of Economy of Peru, Dr. Sahar Nasr, Minister of International Cooperation of Egypt, Dr. Francisco Gaetani, Deputy Executive Secretary at the Ministry of Planning, Budget, and Management of Brazil, and Mr. Francis Kariuki, Director General of the Competition Authority of Kenya and a board member of the Competition Commission of the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. So let me start the discussion with you, Mr. Kariuki. Building on your ample practitioner's experience in promoting competition in Africa, how can competition policy be a tool to foster economic development?
Yeah, thank you, Anabel. And let me first start by thanking the World Bank for inviting me to be part of this panel, which is going to discuss in regard to how competition policy can be used to drive shared prosperity and inclusive growth. Having said that, I would like to start from a platform that health competition can certainly benefit consumers. And when I talk about consumers, I'm talking also about the government. And also competition policy can help the business players in regard to when they play within their rules, how they can increase their productivity and also their profitability. Why am I saying this? Why am I saying this is when I look at the opposite side, when there's weak competition, what happens? One is that there's impediment in the development of markets, which otherwise would have developed. Number two is that there's an unnecessarily business or stagnation of business operations due to what I may call intrusiveness of government through regulations which hinder competition in the market. And therefore, at the end of it, is that you'll find that there's a lot of negative effect to the consumers in the market in terms of the prices which are offered in the market and in terms of the quality and the goods which are offered in the market, they are not adequate. In Kenya, for example, let me go down to where I live, is we have realized that competition affects growth and shared prosperity in some of the key input sectors, which the Secretary General has mentioned partly. For example, in areas of telecommunications, financial services, transportation, and these key input sectors, when they are not competitive, of course they affect our industrial growth and also the competitiveness of our products in the international market. The other part, how weak competition affects, it's in terms of the barriers to entry. And these barriers to entry can be part of restrictive regulatory obstacles caused by the government. And number two, in terms of the behavior, that is the dominance of some firms in the market. And therefore, they can deter entry into the market to the detriment of the consumer, of course. And the other area which also where frail competition can cause negative effects is in terms of government procurement, where we have suppliers colluding or having some kind of bid rigging, and therefore government incurs a lot of expenditure in acquiring the services it's supposed to offer to its citizenry to the detriment of the services which it's supposed to offer to the other areas. In order to handle this, what is the Competition Authority of Kenya doing? It is having a two-pronged approach. One, it's advising the government in terms of reducing or removing those regulatory obstacles it has inputted in the market, and advising it and giving it alternatives of how it can achieve what it intends to achieve when putting those obstacles. The other area is that also the Competition Authority itself, it's focusing on enforcement of the law which it has been mandated by the Parliament. Having said that, is that obviously we have to appreciate that governments, they regulate because of some certain reasons. For example, they may come up with regulations on price controls because there has been market failures, or they can come up with other regulations to achieve social goals. However, what we say in the Kenyan Competition Authority, in any contestable market where a market can accommodate two players and more, there's no need of government intrusiveness. And having said that, and the President of Kenya appreciates that, sometimes last year he ordered the Competition Authority of Kenya to review all the existing regulations which affect free markets in the economy. And we developed, with the support of the World Bank, a report which highlighted these regulations. Currently, is that we have been told to prioritize the areas which require some policy interventions, and we expect, and I wish my minister was here, but he couldn't be here because of other engagements, they have committed to start including them in the next budget, which is going to read this June. And the focus generally, the areas we are focusing on, it's on agriculture and the input sector. And to echo what also the Secretary General has said, is that how we have done this, it's trying to show the impact of the removal of these regulations, how it can have some positive effect in the economy. With the support of the World Bank, we have shown the government, with the removal of product market regulations in the service sector in Kenya, is that we can reduce, or we can increase, the growth by 0.39 percentage points. And this translates to $218 million per annum. This has really, obviously for good reasons, excited the government. Number two is that also reduction or removal of regulations which affect competition negatively in the professional services to the detriment of the poor, that they cannot acquire legal services, or even the government itself, when it has some legal cases, that it's incurring a lot of expenditure on legal defense. We have shown that when you remove this, is that you can make a lot of savings to the national kitty. Also, is that in the enforcement area, the authority also has focused on ensuring, creating awareness, and also what I may call advocacy. We have come up with what we call special compliance program, is that in the 4 years we have been in the process, is that we have spent a lot of resources focusing on cases which the trade associations have been repeating more often. And we thought that the key thing is that we can open a window where we can give them some, may I call it amnesty, and we encourage internal regulation, self-regulation, so that we can save some of our resources which we are using for enforcement. And we have seen, especially in the financial services, that is the insurance sector and all that, people, they have engaged themselves in terms of internal self-regulation. The other issue in terms of investigation of cartel agreements, we have continued investigating. We have investigating a cartel agreement where the firms had colluded to bid for some certain government bids, and we have calculated the impact. In one single specific bid rigging, we saw that we made a saving to the government of about 72 million Kenyan shillings. Having said that, is that to summarize, is that competition has an impact on growth, and definitely productivity and competitiveness of the Kenyan economy. And obviously with the projected pickup in growth being weaker than previously, as IMF has indicated in the last few days, there's need for actions to boost output. And this, you can boost output through reduction in barriers to entry, and obviously is that encouraging innovation in the market. And this is exactly what we are focusing on.
All right, thank you very much, Francis, and thank you also for your leadership in driving competition policy reforms in Kenya. Dr. Nasr, let me turn over to you now and ask you, how can pro-competition reforms support economic development in Egypt?
Thank you very
I think you can go ahead and speak.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anabel. It's lovely to be back here with you among family and friends and colleagues. For Egypt, the government believes in boosting inclusive growth and shared economic prosperity. Okay. And in that context, and that's based on the keenness to ensure that consumers get the best quality services and the best pricing too. And that's especially in areas where lagging regions, where that becomes a bigger challenge, and hence promoting competition across the board is very critical. Also, in terms of producers, there's the need for level playing field, and that's one key area that the government has been working on, ensuring a level playing field, and also especially in issues such as procurement, and ensuring that there is real competition between the private sector and state-owned interventions there. There has been efforts done on various fronts. First, through the establishment of the Competition Authority, which has played a very pivotal role in that regard, through the issuance of several anti-cartel measures, but also ensuring free entry and exit, and enforcement and compliance of all these measures that promote competition, because that was not very evident in the past, and the authority had played a very pivotal role in putting forward regulations, ensuring that the companies are in compliance with, and also ensuring enforcement and taking the right measures when needed. On another front, there has been the issuance of a new investment law, because one key challenge was the lack of level playing field in terms of access to information. Access to data, and providing different companies equal opportunity is also very important, and the new investment law ensures that by being more transparent about the regulatory framework and where the firms can operate. A third area is connectivity and transportation. Egypt has a very strategic location connecting countries in Africa with Asia and Europe. And in that context, there has been several mega projects, such as the Suez Canal and the Golden Triangle, and a lot of efforts also in Upper Egypt. And that's also with the main objective of promoting competition, ensuring that also the various zones are free from the bureaucracy, free from the regulations that create lack of competition overall, and especially in the procurement area, that was a key challenge in Egypt. So that's an area also. Mega projects are also linked to clusters, because we are very aware that the SMEs is a very important sector, and that's the job creator. Because when we're talking about promoting prosperity, is also we want to make sure that we're not only talking about large firms, but also the smaller and medium, which are usually at a disadvantage in terms of entry, in terms of exit, in terms of access to markets, access to finance. That's a major challenge. So there's a lot of focus on the regulatory framework, the access to finance. There's also the issuance of the microfinance too, because they were also not having equal opportunity at all, whether through the formal financial sector. So also the payment system has been eased so that smaller firms can access. The mobile payment is also another instrument that the government is using and promoting to enhance competition. That's mainly the key pillars that we've worked on, and I also want to take this opportunity to thank the World Bank, but also OECD, who've been doing a lot of analytical work, because identifying the challenges and moving forward with reforms require also the indicators that you have mentioned, because in many cases you need to know where your country is ranked among others in the region, but also among other developing and developed economies once we're operating in a global world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sahar. I think it's very encouraging to see all the important steps that Egypt has been taking to introduce more competition into the Egyptian market. Dr. Segura, let me turn over to you now. In 2015, Peru passed two important competition reforms. On the one hand, you enhanced the tools for anti-cartel enforcement, and on the other, you strengthened the mandate of a unique institution in the world, the Commission for the Elimination of Bureaucratic Barriers. So how do you expect that these changes will boost the development of competitive Peruvian markets, including those at the subnational level?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. Well, first to have an overview, Peru is a country that is very open in general to competition. So country was economic model is based on treating investments, both foreign and domestic, on equal terms as a constitutional level. We're a very open economy in general. We have free trade agreements with countries representing over 90% of world trade. So in general, we do like competition, which doesn't mean that we don't have lots of things to do at a regulatory level. Going specifically into your questions, we have a very strong competition authority. It exists for over, about 25 years ago. And indeed, we created about just a few months ago, we introduced these two new programs. So we gave this authority these new two abilities. One is a leniency program to fight cartels. Basically, give the proper incentives. This is shaped in image of some OECD recommendations to give incentives to those who participate in the cartels to provide information in exchange for of course, lesser penalties, so as to be able to give away those that have been practicing these forbidden practices, actually. Actually, the program is really new. It's been in force for a few months, but there was a very high-profile case that already it was discovered based on this leniency law. The second one, as you mentioned, is the Commission for the Elimination of Bureaucratic Barriers, which we created a few years ago, but we have, actually in 2 rounds, we have given them more faculties. This might seem like a small issue, but it's actually pretty big. Because most of the barriers, particularly in a country like Peru, where you do like at the macro level to promote investment and to promote competition, many times the barriers at the micro level, at the very micro level, when you have to get a license, when you have to get a permit. So this Commission for Elimination of Bureaucratic Barriers has wide powers. It can sanction bureaucrats. It can revert licenses that were wrongly granted or wrongly denied. It can even revert fees that were charged that had no legal base, so they can be reverted to the customers. Over the past 2 or 3 years, they have identified and they have sanctioned over 1,000 or approximately 1,000 barriers to competition that they have sanctioned. So I think that's a way to go at the micro level. Now, there's some other things that we're doing, of course. Ángel was mentioning the Products Markets Regulation Index. And actually, when we compare to Latin America, in that ranking or in the doing business indicators, we rank pretty good. So we like that mirror, actually. We like it very much. But when compared to OECD, then we notice that we're not looking that pretty. So that's the reason why we have a country program with the OECD as well, because we need to improve a lot. I mean, the region, Latin America, is a region as a whole, needs to improve on competition indicators. And there's several more things. I know we're time constrained, so I'm just going to mention them. There's many other things that fit into improving competition, and many times through the channel of productivity that Ángel was mentioning. What have we done over the past few months or a year or so in Peru? We have a new procurement law, for example. We have revamped completely our PPP framework, which of course is critical to developing and to deploying infrastructure. We have created a delivery unit as well to deploy infrastructure. And we have also created a plan, an action plan aimed directly at productivity, which is called the National Production Diversification Plan, which has several lines of, I think, 6 lines of action. I'm just going to mention one, which are the working tables or working groups on sectoral issues, which is very pragmatic. I mean, you just sit with the private sector and you try to map what are the problems they're facing on the ground on a very micro level, things that as example you were mentioning, I mean, a minister or a high-ranking official in the ministry would never think about. And then you just try to lift up from the bottom up. So those are the types of things we're trying to do, more and more so, at least for a country like Peru. The things are at the micro level, at the very bottom of the pyramid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Segura, and we're very pleased to be working with you in some of these efforts at this very micro level, as you say, to identify and attack these barriers to competition. So, Dr. Gaetani, let me turn over to you now to say that, as we know, we are working today in a new normal, if you wish, of lower growth rates and tighter fiscal space. So let me ask you, how can competition policy help in times of economic slowdown?
Well, very timely question. First, I think I have to say that in Brazil, we love the market, but we hate competition. These things, they're treated, they're the different words, let's say. The second point is that if you look to Brazilian economic problems, at the end of the line, there's a cartel, there's a corporatist group or union, a corporatist scheme running. And on the contrary of what we may suggest, competition is not a beautiful business, it's a bloody business. Boosting competition is a bloody business. It's not nice, it hurts. The vested interests and the entrenched interests affected by reforms, they react, they shoot, and they are very good in doing politics. On the contrary of reformers, international institutions, and those engaged in promoting this sort of initiatives. When, for instance, our General Secretary mentions about inclusiveness and competitiveness and productivity, it's a beautiful story. But at the end of the day, the public perception is the opposite. Mm-hmm. Competition means unemployment, means exclusion, means presence of foreign firms. Or it does not need to be like that. But that's the public perception in many ways. Especially in Latin America, you have a very strong nationalist bias, and you have a kind of mindset that suggests that things can be different. And you have a kind of perceptions between national groups, populist policies, and then opening the economy, improving regulation. It's a different sort of arrangement. We in Brazil, we had least recently several improvements in terms of our antitrust agency. Merger and acquisitions, the promoting competition, transactions, anti-competitive practice, the agreements, lenience agreements. And these are fine. This is important. These are important initiatives. But joining my Peruvian colleague, I'd like to mention that we're far from really meaningful reforms. If you look to all OECD rankings, we are getting worse. And I'm telling that not because of the economic crisis, we are getting worse before the crisis. We're still a very closed economy. We're facing difficulties in opening it. Our regulatory agencies, they are in place, but they are not pursuing competition as they should. And the question is why? Why is it so difficult? I like to tell 3 brief stories just to instigate the discussions. The first one, it's about our current scandals related to Petrobras, which is dragging all the big engineering firms to the courts. So all the market players, the big market players in public works, the big engineering firms, they are now facing severe losses. I'm talking about 8, 9 companies. Some of them are multinational. One might ask, isn't it an opportunity for opening the market? And the answer is not clear. The answer is hesitant. Second story. We have gone through several reforms in the environmental area, my previous job, in which we now implement a whole environmental registry that's basically unifying the landscape use story, the agribusiness story. They are now taking the lead on the environmental concerns. In the Brazilian agribusiness sector, it's a global player. It's a leading force in transforming the economy. And they're embracing the environmental agenda. And they want to discuss now green protectionism, But in other terms, they want to set the global agenda in terms of green protectionism. Well, interesting. Instead of playing defense, they want to define global standards for agriculture. Imagine this debate in France or in the US. This is a little bit reverse the signal. Interesting. The third story. We had, in the last 14 years in Brazil, 3-4 cycles of industrial and innovation policies. And our productivity didn't improve. Why? I'm bringing the problems to you because countries like my country, we have to focus on the trade-offs, the challenge, the puzzles. Otherwise, we don't change. And the answers for these problems, they depend on a more comprehensive approach in terms of competition, productivity, opening the economy, introducing healthy regulatory practices, and the policy coherence of these reforms, it has to be built politically. And here we face a problem. Building this case politically is not a trivial task. I also like to emphasize the point made by Peruvian colleague about the role of law, not the rule of law, the role of law. Because at the macro level, especially in federalist countries, when you discuss transaction costs, when you discuss cutting red tape, you have another industry of interests that are not visible immediately. You're talking about local, provincial, and federal details, and the devil lies in the details. And the protection is that these details provide to the inefficiency of the local firms or entrenched interest is huge. The questions about boosting competition in the moment of that your economy is going down the drain. Well, some things they are easy to be done in a crisis. Never waste a crisis. We have a huge crisis now, so it's a huge opportunity, but it will hurt. And imposing losses, as you know, this is a political game. It's not only a policy game. And we'll have an opportunity in Brazil in the next probably 2-3 years to process several of these trade-offs. But in order to overcome these conflicts, we have to organize the problem, model the choices, inform the public opinion in order to enable proper policy choice. And this is really challenging. Finally, just to conclude, I think that we have a lot to do in terms of competition policies in Brazil. OECD and the World Bank are probably the biggest, or not the biggest, but the most important global hubs in terms of knowledge. And all rankings, they are subject to be contested, to be questioned about the methodology, the criteria, how to compare, but they are a health embarrassment. They produce an embarrassment for the countries. They suggest questions. They suggest issues that sometimes we could not raise by ourselves. And I think that in both cases, we are now working closer to both institutions in order to know more about ourselves. Sometimes we have difficulties to compare, to contrast our Latin American colleagues, our global partners colleagues, but we need to engage in this policy learning exercise in order to face our challenge in a more productive and better perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gaetani. Let me say that I think from this first round of questions, I think that a very important takeaway is that pro-competition reforms are very important not only to transform individual markets, but furthermore to promote growth and shared prosperity. But we have also heard that tackling some of these challenges is very difficult. It is very painful. And this is why it is important that institutions like the World Bank Group, like OECD, working jointly, can provide tools to policymakers who are interested in pursuing these reforms to facilitate the possibility of these reforms actually taking place. So I think that even though many of these reforms are complex and difficult, there are a number of success stories. And it is important to also listen to these success stories to understand how is it that policymakers have gone about it. So I will come to our ministers here with a very brief question and a very brief answer, because I would like to involve and have a time for at least one question from the audience and one question online. So let me come back to you, Dr. Gaetani, for a very brief question to ask you. Brazil is being honored in this year in this competition advocacy contest. So how critical is effective competition for increasing governance and better public spending in Brazil?
Well, as many other countries, our main challenge is to modernize our infrastructure. But if you look to the infrastructure sectors, airports, railways, ports, power, energy, these are not sectors known by their competitiveness. These are sectors that are usually commanded by few firms, naturally and even globally speaking. We have, for our antitrust agency and through some policy initiatives taken by the ministries, opening this market to international competition, which enables some of these investments now they are carried out by foreign firms, which is a huge improvement in a country with the sort of a kind of more nationalist bias in strategic sectors. The ideology of the commanding heights, the sectors that command the economy, that this sector should be commanded by national firms, is now giving place to a more open perspective. But this is an ongoing change. And each how can I say, making our economy more open to foreign investments, the crisis, we think, will help this perspective. Because we have an asymmetry in the global flux of resource. We have a huge liquidity in international asset funds, and we have huge demands for investments in developing countries. How to make these things work, it's our challenge. Once I heard a global part of McKinsey say something very interesting. He was saying that only the market could save the state in terms of efficiency, contestability, and only the state could save the markets in terms of ensuring competition. So I think that's the idea. We have in our case to create an enabling environment to ensure and to preserve competition. This is something that's not a familiar task for the state, but we have to improve our capabilities, and we count on your both institutions in this process of modernizing and policy learning. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Segura, Peru, who's also a winner in this year's contest, is also party to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. And the TPP has taken an important stand in terms of promoting pro-competition policies. What role do you see for trade agreement and competition policies working together to increase productivity and competitiveness in your country? 1 minute.
Yeah, well. Okay. Well, yeah, I think, I mentioned at the beginning of my previous intervention, one way of fostering competition is opening your economy to the world. Peru has done that, a while ago, and now we're part of the TPP. TPP's stipulations go even far beyond the chapter of specific competition policy, which is critical. You have chapters on rules of origin, for example, on technical barriers of trade, on the behavior and what's allowed for public sector enterprises, SOEs. So in general, I think having common practices across countries in terms of the behavior when they trade and when they promote investments, because of course all these mechanisms, have these mechanisms to solve investment disputes across investors that are from these countries, are key to enhancing competition, because some of our countries really need to strengthen their institutionality, particularly at enacting the rule of law, for example. So also these agreements help you in giving up escape clauses in order to resolve and give more credibility to a country that you're going to find ways to solve whatever discrepancy you have. So I think there's several other things. The TPP it's really a very, very technical treaty that should benefit all the parties, and I think should be sort of exported to other countries as well.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Nasr, you are a champion of cutting red tape and reducing barriers to entry. So can you tell us, how is it that you have done it, and how do you think has this helped Egypt realize its broader developmental goals?
Removing red tape and addressing the bureaucracy has mainly been done. I want to give credit to two of my colleagues who've been working extensively on that. The Minister of Trade and Industry, who's been supporting extensively the Competition Authority. He's done a lot of streamlining of industrial licensing and all the streamlining of industrial procedures that were a key challenge for private sector overall and competition. Also, in terms of the one-stop shop that comes under Ministry of Investment, that's one major area. A lot has been done, but more is required, and this is one area we're working very closely with the World Bank and specifically your team, Anabel, because we believe that that will even help us move that even further.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Francis, back to you for like 30 seconds. Kenya has been recognized in the competition advocacy work for its role in promoting competition policy in health that last year, and this year in agriculture, for unlocking investment in agriculture. So how have you done it?
Thank you. From my experience I have in enforcing competition is that, one, competition is not easily understood. Number two, maybe it's not liked. So how to make yourself visible is that you have to prioritize your activities, enforcement activities, with the national economic agenda. In Kenya, the national economic agenda is encapsulated very well under the Vision 2030. And as an authority, we are focused on two sectors: agriculture sector and the financial services sector. And what we do is that you don't just approach the government with a word of mouth, is that you develop reports and show the obstacles of competition within these sectors, and show the government the impact. If at all these obstacles are removed, how can it impact on the poor? In the agriculture sector, we have published, with the support of the World Bank, some of the reports showing that if at all we reduce subsidies, if at all we open up some of the markets, we can reduce the level of poverty by 1.5%. We have opened up in some industries in the agriculture sector, agro-processing in the tea sector, and we have managed to increase the prices of tea by 280%. And this is something which has really made us be visible within the government. The other issue is that you have to collaborate and cooperate with other government agencies, and therefore develop some cooperation agreements with the other sector regulators, especially the agriculture sector regulator and also the regulators in the financial services.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis. I'm going to go now with a question that we received online, and if there's anyone here in the audience who would like to ask a question, can we please bring a mic so that we can have, and please make it brief. Our question online is from Haria, who asks, how can we encourage competition to bring prosperity to small and medium-sized enterprises? So who of our panelists would like to talk a little bit shortly about the link between competition policy and small and medium-sized enterprises? So, Sahar.
I think one of the key challenges, actually, when we talk about competition in developing economies is the SMEs. The small and medium are often underprivileged in many ways in terms of having the resources to get the skills, to do even the audit, to do the legal requirement, to understand the regulatory framework. If it's not very transparent and clear, they're often at a disadvantage, and hence they need to, when we're talking about promoting competition, I think more emphasis needs to be given to SMEs. Even in terms of access to markets, they're not given equal opportunities. There's the large and the privileged firms who often have better access to the different resources and to different markets and to the policymakers, even in pushing. So when we're talking about, as mentioned by my colleague from Kenya, so you also want to disentangle any parliamentarians from the business community, from the policymakers, then you will, because their voices are often not heard well, and we need to put more emphasis on their needs.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your response. We have a question here, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Eleanor Fox from New York University. First, thanks very much to the World Bank and the OECD. If you'll permit me one word of more thanks. For scores of years, it seemed that competition law and competition policy was, in effect, owned by the developed world, making enabled businesses get richer and more efficient. And I think both the World Bank and the OECD have enlarged that conversation and brought it where it ought to be and shown the world how competition policy really ought to and can work for those who are the poorest. So I want to ask, and particularly may I ask Secretary General Gurría, we've heard very creative ideas and programs executed by the developing countries, including our friends on the podium. We hear so often that developing countries can learn this and that and the other thing from the developed world. Do you think there is a good case for the other way around? Do you think that the developed world can learn from the developing countries, and what and how? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this is actually a great segue to closing remarks that I would like Mr. Gurría to make. So if you can organize them maybe around this question, Ángel.
Yes. Actually, this is what the OECD is about. We gather the best practices. We see what worked, what didn't work. It's all evidence-based, by the way. So that gives it, as I mentioned before, that gives it the clout, that gives it the power, that gives it the muscle. You show the numbers, you show the methodology. You say, okay, these are the lessons. And the idea is to develop sets of numbers and statistics that speak to you. You know, they whisper in your ear. They tell you, they suggest what are the policies, and not just numbers or statistics, but what are the policies that should be followed. And yes, they are. This is two-way street. We get a lot of experiences about what works better in developed countries, and they are not all applicable automatically to developing countries. But then you have solutions in developing countries or emerging economies which are absolutely applicable. And also remember, developed economies are not one single type and one, homogeneous place or one large city. They're all over the place. And you have differences, you have territorial differences. Even 200 kilometers away in Sweden or in Finland or in Austria, whatever, the conditions are very different. So yes, we use this and we pass it around. So among the different developed countries, among the developing countries, among the emerging economies, and then, everybody on board, you put it in the mixer, and then, you shake it, and it was James Bond, stirred, not shaken, or whatever it was. This is the way. The idea is that it services and it's useful for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ángel. I think that we can take one additional question from our audience. Yes, sir, the gentleman here in the back, if we have a mic, please.
My name is Obed Ligate. I'm a researcher based in Virginia, but I'm originally from Tanzania. And I want to make my question to all the panelists, but my colleague, Mr. Kariuki, can also emphasize better. So Africa is embarking on an industrial policy. It has got a lot of market imperfections, and it's very nascent, so it won't be able to compete naturally. The commodities, we have all noted that Africa needs to add value to its agricultural products. And I'm just wondering how the competition policy can boost productivity when it's a nascent industry, especially in value addition. Won't it be an impediment, or would it be something that can boost the industrial policy, which is just starting from scratch? To say it further, to kind of simplify it, you sell sugar in Dar es Salaam, in my home country, and you import sugar from Brazil. Naturally, the prices will be, Brazilian sugar might be much more cheaper. And with all the imperfections in the market in our countries, the final product may be a bit more expensive, and naturally we may not be able to be more productive and more competitive in the long run. So it has got kind of two sides of the coin. Can somebody kind of explain that?
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. So Francis, I'm going to give the mic to you for another 30-second response. Thank you.
I totally empathize with what you're asking, but I think we need to look ourselves back to where we came from. In Kenya, we call it the 1965 paper on economic growth, where we were talking about Pan-Africanism and where we were protecting our industries so that at least we can grow, we can make ourselves better. But obviously from where we stand is that the world is moving. And how is the world is moving is that it's a global market. Even within Africa itself is that we are coming up with regional economic communities where we are having borderless economies. And therefore, the issue of protectionism from the word go does not exist. And therefore, how do we make our industries better or more competitive? And as I was talking, is that there was something I raised in regard to making our industries more competitive in terms of ensuring that the key input markets are competitive. That is the telecommunication, the financial services, and and the electricity and transportation. The moment we make those industries more competitive is that we will be able to make our industries to be more efficient, and that is what we are lacking at the moment. Currently, for example, what you're talking about, the sugar industry. I'll give my example in Kenya, where we have 5 state-owned enterprises, sugar enterprises, which they are using old equipment which were installed in the 1970s. The new private sectors who have come in to invest in the sugar industry is that their cost of production is by half of what the government institutions, which have been protected since 1960s. And therefore, if at all we blocked even those other private investors, is that it shows that our sugar would continue costing more than that percentage. And as the Secretary General indicated, the poor are usually the most hurt because according to the statistics we have, the poor use 25% of their consumption expenditure on sugar. And therefore, if at all the Kenyan consumers continue within these Kenyan products or pro-government products, is that will make our people poorer by 1.5%. That is what I would suggest.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis. And let me thank all of the speakers for your insights and for your and for really sharing with us your experience from working in this particular sector. Let me conclude with a reflection here, which is that we know through experience that conditional cash transfers in countries like Mexico, Brazil, Peru have been very effective in improving the lives of poor people by adding about 10% to their income. So why not invest in tackling economic cartels which artificially increase the prices of basic consumer goods by an even greater amount. I think that it is time that we reflect upon this and the important role that competition policy can actually play in eliminating poverty and sharing and boosting shared prosperity. And I'm sure that I hope that the instruments like this joint report that we launched today with the OECD and the World Bank Group will help inform policymakers and give them further advocacy tools to undertake these important reforms. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Mr. Gurría, thank you all.